let's talk about, your three main works that you've been working on over a decade, since 2011. And let's start with the first one, Drawing a Hypothesis, Figures of Thought. So can you perhaps tell us a little bit about the project and how it started?
Yeah, Drawing a Hypothesis, Figures of Thought. Yeah, we can use as an entry point or also like a springboard into my research. As I said, for years, I'm fascinated by diagrams, and I was questioning myself how all these kind of visual artifacts, such as graphic forms of visualizing complex ways into knowledge, could be comprehended else from an artistic point of view. So I invited artists and scientists to develop with me new forms of narratives by tracing the speculative potential of diagrams. And in the resulting publication, this became a quite rich compendium of all sorts of figures of thoughts and figures of speech, somehow describing this reflexive character of the diagram and challenging poetic ways of readership. In this project, the intuitive part of knowing is as vital as the so-called cognitive part, I would say.
That's very interesting, and the fact that this is a kind of a widely collaborative project where you've been working with people of different backgrounds, artists, writers, scientists, who responded to the diagrams that you shared and you've been making. So was this a way of handing over or sharing the artistic license that we talked about in some way or some form?
Yeah, I think it was also to open, an attempt or a gesture to open the kind of solitude in the artist studio, kind of to reach out and start to send diagrams and drawings to others, people I have never met before, and getting in the form of conversation. Yeah. So the very kind of basic principle is a ping pong, sending, receiving, answer, response. So I started to send out my drawings to various scientists, artists, and authors, and always with a request for a written interpretation, kind of a reflection or a speculation of what they could see in the diagrams, so that I, in return, I could react again to their words with new drawings. So it was a game, one could say, a bit like a Rorschach test. Yeah. And in return, I was taking their inputs and reactions as a provocation for thinking ahead, like thinking further on the nature of the diagram, but also taking it as a starting point for new work in the studio, making drawings, installations, or even performances. And for me, this associative aspect of translation, was very important, that it could materialize in different media. In that whole project, I was very kind of curious about the open-endedness, and then I think it took almost 7 years before I was able, with a graphic designer, to bring it kind of in a book form. At the moment, I felt like it exploded. I could not kind of draw it back together. Yeah, it was so rhizomatic somehow. And then somehow I was able to make a book out of it. But also then the book was not the end point. It was also then the idea with one author, writer Emma Cocker, to do a series of performance lectures of the book. So taking the book again, as you said, like a starting point to draw on drawing a hypothesis. And I think the concept of the figure was very central to the whole publication, kind of understanding it as a field with a kind of vast interconnectedness, also as a form in motion, kind of a vital envelope, also a figure is, I would say, something that kind of can specify something, an entity, but is like in motion, yeah. And the basic, I would say, like operation was like using these diagrams as kind of a new visual lingua franca, one could call them, like a new pictographic language. Everybody kind of knew or thought he or she knew how to interpret diagrams. They became kind of a currency, no, in our Western knowledge system. And this, I think, this circumstance supported my inquiry, kind of in this finding out these transitions between knowing and not knowing. Yeah, I think you're.
Yeah,
muted.
I was muted, sorry. I think it's quite interesting in the sense that this kind of, let's say, the ping pong of, receiving and, like regenerating. But I'm also like quite curious if, anyone didn't want to collaborate. That kind of like cumulative production phase.
Absolutely. No, I mean, again, now it was a long road, and it was never that linear as I might now recall it. There were, I reached out to about 50 people in the publication. In the end, there were 30 kind of selected of these kind of ping pongs. But there were scientists who kind of, as you said, like they became quite resistant. Yeah. They said like, I cannot, respond to it because I don't know the context, and then I would start to speculate, and that's not scientific. Yeah. In return, others also, not only artists or kind of writers, authors, like other scientists, they felt like very freed from the restraints of the scientific method and kind of started to drift and kind of engage in this kind of more speculative way of thinking, lateral thinking. Getting this kind of more associative state of mind where unexpected things, emerge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, actually, this kind of like this balancing act. But I'm also quite curious about, like the balancing act that you've been, in a way, employing while you were exhibiting Drawing a Hypothesis, Figures of Thought. If you were to, let's go from the 3 as our number for today. So if you were to choose like 3 manifestations of Drawing a Hypothesis, Figures of Thought over the last years, what would they be?
Well, I would say like immediately the exhibition in Graz, where you invited me, and which was co-created by Margit Neuhold, the exhibition Study on Knowledge. I think it was one of these first crystallizing moments, bringing artifacts from that process together, kind of establishing, I think I called it table of contents, like a table with objects and diagrams on it, but also like doing a performance, together with Emma Cocker. There was also, like, I think importantly, a show in the Muka in Antwerp on graphology. I think that was also a beautiful manifestation of the project. Or another exhibition in Detroit called My Brain is in My Inkstand. Yeah, that was very beautiful on this kind of epistemic process in drawing. So yeah, and then I think also the whole book became kind of an inspiration for a project at the Drawing Center in New York, where the drawings were further posted to artists or using that kind of method of ping-ponging, so they could respond with other drawings and artistic work and responses. Yeah.
That's quite interesting, actually, as well. It kind of like keeps proliferating. The project keeps proliferating. So I want to kind of, again, draw us back to, examining some of the key concepts in your work. And when we etymologically examine like the concepts such as figure, thought, diagram, I feel like this kind of like leads us to a configuration of speech acts. So like if we kind of like unpack figure, for instance, figure can be described as the graphic representation of form. It could be of a person. Mm-hmm. And following like thought is the action of process of cogitation. So like one thing that you also like refer to, one quote or reference you make in the introduction of the book by Roland Barthes, like as he talks about thought as like a rear view window of our consciousness, which I find it like super poignant. Mm-hmm. And the last description would be like of a diagram. If we kind of like put that in a very basic terms, after you have complexly, elaborated your position, it can be described as a visual outline of conceptual, functional, or epistemological relationships. So it's almost like you're taking us, like through your works and through drawing a hypothesis, figures of thought, you're kind of taking us through representation to cogitation and visualization. And there I feel like there's kind of like almost like an kind of inescapable production of co-creation of subjectivity.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, like the subjectivity is, like subjectivity of you as the artist, melding with subjectivity of other bodies, like such as the thinking, contributing bodies of your collaboration partners, and as well as the audiences. And how do you kind of like, how do you view that? Like, how do you also negotiate that?
I mean, for me, the term figure is kind of, it's very interesting, because I think, the figure itself and the figurative certainly have a very long tradition in the arts. But my take is, rather than following this kind of beaten track of the classical figurative, I would suggest to approach the word figure more via its diagrammatic meaning, or in a more dynamic sense, or in its almost gymnastic, choreographic sense, as Roland Barthes suggests, to understand figures as something always moving, always changing, kind of living, flexible, fluid. A figure as something which moves and makes you move too, as a vital entity, which is always embedded in a surrounding, and in communication with its environment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's very beautifully put through. But then, what about figures of thought, or figure of thought?
That's a good question. I think maybe I don't have an answer yet, because the figure itself is something kind of a living, alive, and the process of thinking too. So when they two come together, it gets very complex. I just see there's a strong, relation between the figure and the diagram, and the understanding of the figure in relation to the processes of thinking, which brings also the self-reflexive complexity into the play, which kind of suddenly creates a very dynamic loop, between the figure, the figuration in the process of figuring something or figuring something out or forming a thought. So I would say like thinking, it's also like thinking content as a form, a forming form, and it's a thought in action, or thinking in action. So kind of a figure of thought is making sense in the very act of thinking and becoming aware of maybe of the own fragility of this kind of process, of establishing some kind of configuration. So this kind of questions, they kind of propelled my work over a decade, and I think a certain answer is yet to come.
I think that's very interesting, and that's very, in a way, great that you don't have an answer yet, and that also kind of is reflective of, the depth of your inquiry. But also, I think it is very true in the sense that it is not easily mapped. But then your kind of inquiry into figures continue with the following project, choreographic figures and choreo-graphic figures. So, and then you mostly refer to this project as like kind of like this transition from diagramming to embodiment of diagrams. So it's almost like embodied diagrams. And that you kind of like I feel like include further more the performative aspect. So perhaps can you take us through this project?
Yeah, I think it kind of announced itself in working on the drawing a hypothesis project that somehow a kind of a necessary step had to be done in the research. So kind of also opening up again, not only the studio for sending out the drawings, but like inviting other people to join me, in a studio space and be there not only for one day, but up to 3 weeks, and suddenly things start to happen, So I think this project, choreographic figure, can very much serve as an example where the nature of knowledge production via thinking in action, or what we also called thinking, feeling, knowing, was operative within this kind of collaborative practices and was explored together. Together with an interdisciplinary team. Again, writer Emma Cocker played an important role as a key researcher, choreographer Maria Kreil, and many other guests who came to the studio, and me as a visual artist and performer. We were inquiring kind of these new forms of notation, of these hidden aspects in the creative process, kind of sitting between the lines of drawing, choreography, and writing, and developing kind of together shared figures of thought, speech, and movement. And I think for all these, we proposed the concept of the choreo-graphic figure as a diagrammatic assemblage for bringing all these configurations into relation. So imagine releasing the drawn diagram from the two-dimensional page, or imagine for writing and speaking beyond the figure of speech and beyond kind of this domain of language and the regime of signification, or imagine choreography beyond the space of the body and the space of the theater, the stage. Yeah. And suddenly these kind of three practices and coalesced, yeah, in the project.
It's kind of like, sorry, it's almost like kind of like mirroring of what you said at the beginning about drawing, you know, like the line, the pencil, the arm, the atmosphere, the temperature. And I feel like that is kind of like almost expanded into...
Absolutely, yeah. Expanded and also kind of reflected through other practices, through other personalities, identities, materials. So kind of also maybe raising the level of complexity, yeah, and also what can be controlled, yeah, because that's also always this thing. Like one has to think, wow, now I'm out of control. The things control me, and that's a very beautiful moment also to kind of let that happen. So we worked in this kind of state of mind. We worked for 4 years in various art and performance spaces all over Europe, like the Tanzquartier in Vienna was a partner, or APAS in Brussels, or the Performing Arts Forum in France, and Siobhan Davis Center, the studios in London, or the UFA studios of HCT in Berlin. So we came together, we stayed in these kind of studio spaces for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And our kind of key element was to develop a sense for this how-ness, yeah, of these relations, of these complex relations between the processes of figuring something out and the emergence of these choreographic figures, as I explained to you. And I think some specific somatic practices informed here our quest on the way of tracing these kind of deep interrelations between the mind, the body, the world, and materials. And we were seeking kind of for an approach to give tangible articulation to the meaning of these relations as generative forces within the making of knowledge. Rather through, I would say, like life diagramming, yeah, these flows of thinking operative within every artistic inquiry, and kind of aiming for a more, as you said, like an embodied diagrammatics.
That is very interesting, actually, and it's also kind of like it's quite curious as well, because it somehow feels like very abstract and somehow feels very kind of like, you know, tangible. So, and I'm very much interested in your kind of like addition of how to this.
Yeah.
So, you know, like if we go back to, you know, like 5 W's and 1 how, and 5 W's meaning the, you know, like questions of who, what, when, where, and why. And they provide us the background of any narrative, and kind of like allow us to kind of like get a kind of an overall understanding of, you know, like what's going on, and how is this kind of like expander, or for instance, like, you know, if we were to say in other words, it's like 5 W's are kind of like the pillars of the context, and how is kind of like this kind of like anchoring, ontological anchor, almost anchoring question mark. So, but I feel like, I mean, like how is like brings risk to a project, but also it can be really rewarding to really explore, let's say, this kind of like connecting threads. It's almost like if we continue from that expansion complexity thread. yeah, I don't know. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think the how, when you look at the term, yeah, it etymologically always refers to the manner or the way in which something is done. And I think this is the critical point. By what means or method something is done, in what state or condition, or you could also say to what extent or degree. So it's this kind of very fine nuances, kind of referring and indicating to activity, to agency, the unfolding of a process, which is often articulated only through verbs, yeah, and adverbs. So this brings, I think, a very different shift, kind of a different quality into the research. So how can you make kind of diagrams when you implement the howness, yeah, into specific materiality of thinking and feeling and kind of and knowing. And for me, the how, one could also say it's less the destination, yeah, rather the whole journey traveled towards kind of towards now, to where you're here now, what matters now, yeah. And I think this approach describes an inquiry which sits deeply or leads deeply into the state or condition of a person, an object, or a whole configuration. So I think it leads really to the state of immanence, yeah, a very specific state. Yeah, you could say you see two apples, yeah, they look completely the same, but when you taste them, they completely taste different. So there is kind of this thing in it, yeah, which interests me.
That's very beautiful. And also, like your mention of the, somatic practices, it kind of like makes me think of the contact zones that you were also mentioning previously. So can you perhaps like expand on that, and how do you, like position them as, I don't know, like, are they, helping us to develop our understanding of the world further, or?
Yeah, I mean, also coming back maybe to the process of working in this kind of studio settings with artists from different backgrounds and disciplines, me coming more from a visual art background, and then suddenly being with dancers and performers, and you say like, okay, let's start at 10, and they would say like, no, we met at 10, but now we need 1.5 hours to warm up, yeah. And then suddenly you are, okay, this is a completely different way into the body, way into being also able to recognize this howness, yeah, how the body feels, how something feels, how you can work with it, yeah. So we started to develop together certain forms of practices of attention, we called it, kind of for sensory heightening and cultivating perceptual awareness, increased alertness, for vigilance and receptivity between us. So these were like, for example, practices of breathing, of slow walking, or voicing, working with the voice, yeah, touching, listening. So very kind of basic operations, but giving them time. And they had the task to kind of reset or retune you, kind of clearing the ground also in order for re-seeing things differently. Kind of also these practices, one could also think like of this meditative approach. They also help you to let go or kind of empty out, make space, and therefore activating a level of awareness somehow beyond that field of the utilitarian or the instrumental or the kind of more judgmental part of us. So these were very important to get in touch with this wholeness, but also to actually be able to recognize these choreographic figures.
I quite like this, like this kind of like preparation as well. It's almost like, like, of course, the warm-up is a necessary ritual for dance, but like, I wonder if there is something for you as well in your practice, or if something has been informed, like, do you now have rituals for starting research, for instance, or ways to, because I think it's also quite interesting, this kind of like this tabula rasa, or this empty vesselness in order to kind of cultivate something. Just as a side question, do you think your practice has been informed from this experience?
Yeah, and then at the same time, it's exactly what you were saying. No, we all have these kind of rituals. Could be before you start writing a text, you now have another coffee, or you open a book and you just like read whatever a page just to get in another state of mind, or you have to, I don't know, check your emails quickly before, or so things like, there are things happening almost unconsciously. And I got also aware of what I actually perform or do before I start, but I was not aware of it. I think in the dance and performance, based on like working with the own body, there's a lot of knowledge in that, but I think in other disciplines, that is, I think, not so much put attention to. So there is a lot of rituals, I would say, for getting in that state of mind. I mean, other people take drugs, or like there had been different at times, so you have to first kind of, and I think that's also in relation to your personality. Some people have to calm them down from where they can start to act, and others have to kind of push them, like to be full on or something. So I think that's interesting also to see from where you have a position, from where you start to speak, actually.
That's quite interesting, actually, as well. Like, it makes me also like think about like energy and vibration, but also it's also like, perhaps like we could also think about, rituals as notations as well. And I want to ask you about notation, because that has been a very important recurring motif in your practice and in, like through these works. So what kind of systems of notation, can you develop for also articulating, let's say, like what we also refer to as like this kind of like left out data, or like something that is like barely perceptible, barely received, like kind of like micro movements or transitions that, like it's almost like it kind of like can fall off your, cusp of awareness. And especially I'm asking that for the sake of the kind of like artistic sense making, because you were also referring to scientific sense making as like the eliminating of the non-necessary. But what about artistic sense making? Where does this kind of like systems of notation come to aid? Or
as I said, we kind of regularly met in different places, bringing all kind of our backgrounds, our practices, our rituals in the same space. And then basically curiosity, we were just like watching kind of what happens. Yeah. And soon we noticed that there were moments where suddenly things started to intensify, or they kind of became calmer, paused, or stayed in a state of suspense. So there was something, yeah. But how to, if you're in your flow of working together, one is writing in one corner, the, I don't know, was building something with materials, another was like working with the body or the voice. And suddenly these kind of practices start to communicate with each other, even if you're not by intent performing together. Yeah. So we thought, like, how can we notate these micro moments, these tiny kind of shifts and nuances? And we started with a very simple like trick. We started to click. Yeah. So when we felt something was kind of happening, yeah, whatever that was, yeah, kind of a felt intensity, we started to make, or with having kind of, the idea was not to get kind of thrown out of your own process, but because if you would start to talk, now I feel you get kind of in another very different state of mind for you and for others. So we just marked kind of these moments, and we recorded all our sessions with video. So the video somehow became indexical in the way that we could kind of come back, pause, and later kind of start to verbalize. I felt this, I was noticing this. And out of these kind of conversations, we kind of started to recollect and kind of reframe these kind of very tiny moments. Yeah. And so we were able to identify and qualify or name kind of these shifts in awareness and what we call like curves of vitality.